afternoon. My name is Jonathan Lawrence. I am director of the Cloud Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy and a professor of political science at Boston College. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the Cloud Fall Colloquium, launching our annual theme on attachment to place in a world of nations. Focusing on this topic is an attempt to capture the many ways that people feel connected to and influenced by the territories, landscapes, sacred spaces, and other places that don't fit easily into the nation-state schema. Looking at the boundless map depicted on our program, one sees a world of possible connections across time and space. Thinking about attachments to the places on that map draws our attention to the cultural, economic, psychological, religious, and other relationships that coexist in the same political space as democratic nations. The author Yves Antoine writes that if space is freedom, then place is security. But since one person's or group's security may be another's uncertainty, place is linked to an imminently political dilemma, joined at birth with contestation. For much of global history, cultural and religious traditions rooted in a given place have been interwoven with the institutions and politics of their societies. Yet, other forces have increasingly encroached upon their prior spheres of influence, including the disruption of economic modernization and the introduction of national borders. Only a handful of generations have passed since the implosion of major empires in the wake of 2 world wars, Romanov, Habsburg, Ottoman, then British and French, that gave way to dozens of new nations, many of their residual frontiers riven by instability. Within the same time frame, not quite 100 years have passed since the last Islamic caliph was evicted from Istanbul. Even less time has elapsed since the creation of a sovereign Vatican city-state. The past century has been marked by displacement and detachment from place and the attendant ambiguities that come with belonging to the nation where one resides. With the entrenchment of nationalism and the enshrinement of citizenship came the demotion of certain ties and the promotion of others. The nation-state, omnipotent within its borders, modulates and moderates these attachments, determining which are compatible with citizenship. Democratizing societies have cut their teeth learning these lessons in coexistence. Moreover, old imperial plates are still shifting tectonically, and nationalist aftershocks continue to agitate democratic life. The collapse of the British and Spanish empires in North America did not preclude conflict centuries later over the border separating the independent nations that succeeded them. In Europe, Russia brutally lays siege to Ukraine, while a stream of refugees departs from Nagorno-Karabakh. This week, Pakistan declared nearly 2 million undocumented people from neighboring Afghanistan to be unwelcome. In North Africa, there are attempts to shore up the Tunisian and Libyan states, not least to reduce the departures that have led to the tragic deaths of hundreds of people in the Mediterranean every month of this year. The logic that, quote, we are here because you were there, is inescapable but incomplete. These developments are as revealing about our present and future as they are about the past. Because the divided response of democracies when faced with challenges that ignore borders, from migration to climate change and disease, betrays their ambivalence towards supranational cooperation. Stymied by the limits of their own territoriality and frequently unable to cede more than a few drops of sovereignty, they nonetheless find that there is no absolute protection that a national border can provide. With the coming holiday weekend upon us, the topic feels especially relevant for democracies established in indigenous lands. Our native-sounding place names belie the absence of our predecessors, and it is striking how little our environment bears the traces of its relatively recent inhabitants. As with much of our troubled history, we've only just begun to reckon with this legacy. This year's cohort of Plough Fellows, many of whom are here among us, are students drawn from across Boston College, engaging with these themes throughout the year, and they will be crafting articles for our spring publication on this topic. So today is just the opening bracket of this public conversation, culminating in a 2-day spring symposium in March. And we're going to be covering a lot of ground today, so we will proceed briskly. I'd just like to thank the Plough Center's faculty affiliates from across the campus who have an important role in moderating today's sessions and keeping pace. Please click the code on your program for their biographies. I'd like to give a special welcome to Paul Romer, who is the new Maier University professor at Boston College, and a very warm welcome to our out-of-town visitors, to our keynote speakers, Karen Markey, who arrived yesterday from New York, Danielle Allen, who came over from Harvard, Charles Maier, who traveled from across the Charles River, and to Mohammed Hassas, who traveled across the Tiber River from Rome to be with us today. So let me begin by introducing Karen Markey. She is the Kellogg Chair of Sociology and Religion at Bard College, and the author of many influential works, including Empire of Difference, Choreography of Sacred Spaces, Shared Sacred Sites, and most recently, Negotiating Democracy and Religious Pluralism, India, Pakistan, and Turkey. Before coming to Bard, Karen was the Haas Distinguished Chair of Religious Diversity at UC Berkeley, and before that, Director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University. Throughout her career, Karen has been a model of scholarly excellence and humane interpersonal relations, and is an example of how to combine meaningful attachment to multiple places while living across borders. So please join me in welcoming Karen today.
And thank you, Jonathan, Nicola, everybody at the Plough Center for organizing this. I'm very happy, actually. I'm short, so I should.
It'll still pick you up. It'll just have to be.
Okay. Okay. So it's funny and a little ironic that I am actually talking about attachment to place, because I am very attached to a place that I cannot go to anymore. And so that place is Istanbul, Turkey, and because of political reasons, I will not be able to probably go back to Istanbul ever. If I was a psychologist, I would tell you of all of the different psychological ways in which I'm trying to disassociate myself from that place so that I don't suffer from it. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm actually a comparative historical sociologist. So today I will raise issues that are comparative across empires and nation states. So the question of attachment to place, which is the study of the connection that develops between individuals and groups and their significant environment, has, I think, gained a lot of importance because of globalization, because of intensification of international mobility, population movements, ethno-religious conflict, and environmental disasters. In the early 1990s, the philosopher Edward Casey, in his book Getting Back into Place, had already spoken of the need to articulate and engage with the analysis of place in modern times, and ask that we give place a position of renewed respect by specifying its power to direct, to stabilize, to memorialize, and identify us, and tell us who and what we are in terms of where we are as well as where we are not. So as a comparative historical sociologist, I'm interested mostly in the macro global transitions and their effects on the experiences of communities that undergo such change. In a way, then, macro-sociological, macro-historical conditions give rise to processes whose long-term effects might have a debilitating consequence. In that, the intervening variable for me, in a sense, is attachment to place. It is because transitions affect people's attachments to their land that difficult resettlement, diaspora existence, politics, violence, and other social outcomes can be observed. Attachment to place also sometimes really fixes identities and makes them available for political mobilization. Attachment to place is exacerbated by movement, and I'll talk a lot about that. But also attachment to place is powerfully experienced by immobility. So the historical ghetto, for example, where Jews lived in European societies, created boundaries not only that served not only to separate, but also to build effective ties to the space. Richard Sennett talks about the ghetto in Venice as a place where, for the Jews, being Jewish became a spatial experience. The ghetto space, he says, was idealized as a real community, as an organic space. So it became a symbolic place where a new understanding of the essence of being Jewish began to define itself. Within its walls, they perfected the sense of belonging and not belonging to the city in which they were always subject to restrictions imposed by the authorities. Now, that was just an example for you, but now I want to go to the real part of my talk, which is the theme of transformation, of transition, especially transition from empire to nation state. And I want to reflect on the competing understandings of attachment to space in each form of political rule, while also analyzing the impact of demographic engineering that was orchestrated in the transition from empire to nation state. So even though the traditional land-based empires, such as the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, the Russians, those, especially the Ottomans, are the one, the Ottoman is the one I study in comparative perspective, did not confine these empires did not confine their ethno-religious communities into strictly defined spaces. And the passage from empire to national state, despite that, wreaked havoc for both of rulers and the ruled. In the wake of World War I, these empires broke apart to create multiple new nationalizing states. War and nationalism were the root causes of these empires' decline and final demise. War created the conditions for state weakness, but nationalism provided the agency for the work of various elites in their demand for independence and the establishment of post-imperial states. So, and there was no doubt, it was helped by 1918 Woodrow Wilson's declaration that all national communities deserved self-determination. So imperial homogeneity and diversity gave transition into multiple examples of nation states and national homogeneity. The principle of one people, one land, and one government became the framework within which new national states operated. With the ambition to create such simplified ethno-religious national states, governments engaged in expulsions, population transfers, and sometimes, as we know, also genocide, though it was in the Ottoman Empire, but in the transition to the modern Turkey, the destruction of the Armenian community in the empire. These disruptions are exactly where I think we see the issues that emerge with attachment to land. That's where we can study them. So I would like to argue that attachment to place, to the land, in the traditional empires was felt and understood differently than the contemporary experience of nation states. Attachment to place in the nation state has become more emotional, more expressive, more passionate, and made us more contentious against the outsiders within and beyond the national borders. Yet, in both empire and nation state, losing one's homeland, being subjected to population exchanges, the violence of such policies were understood as hardship, were thought of, memorialized as deeply problematic and difficult moments. So in a sense, even though empires and nation states have different forms of attachment, they come together in this, in the use of, in the nostalgia for space when people are moved, when they are exiled, etc. For the nation state, those who remain outside the putative homeland and develop diaspora communities, they end up being politicized in different ways. They either can become, strident nationalists, or form attachments to the land in ambiguous and ambivalent fashion. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So I want to go through empire, transition, and nation state relatively quickly and give you a couple of examples because I probably will not have a lot of time. Empires were composite polities, as we know, where ethnic and religious difference were integrated and separated into self-sustaining, autonomous cultural communities. At the general level, we can argue that because there was so much movement and so much fluidity in empires, it was always imagined locally. People imagined just their locality. And because empires had mixed populations, attachment to land was based on mixity, on interrelations, and as a result, it was not contentious during empire. By contrast, we know nation states make this attachment to place much more antagonistic. For the large pre-modern land-based empires, also the concept of frontier evokes the inability to reach the ends of the territory, and so this territory that is very far away and where boundaries are really fluid and porous, where people can cross, makes it, especially at the frontiers, very difficult for people to actually be attached to the place. So traditional empires, especially those that have moving communities, nomads and tribal groups, did not have this strong attachment to place. But traditional empires did not worry about building a sense of community association and attachment to place. They left it to community leaders to do that. Such communities and perceptions of belonging were forged either by community leaders of the millet, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, or one village or neighborhood at a time through the relational structures that connected the people to each other and to the local authorities. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, the courts, when there was a land settlement issue, they would ask the elders of the community, the people who had prior knowledge, what the boundaries were, where the lines were, what the the local knowledge was. And as such, community members basically themselves told the government what the land was like and what the attachment to the land was. So they had a collective memory of the space and articulated it bottom up. Similarly in cities, and I'm going to skip, but I want to talk about attachment to place in empires, especially the Ottoman Empire, which is manifested in shared sacred sites, because that's what I work in right now. Shared sacred sites are actually, let me define them, are religious sanctuaries where people from different religions and ethnic backgrounds are able to live with difference, accommodate to each other's religious needs, and negotiate in public their otherness. In these sites, attachment to place came through religion, but a certain flexibility was inserted into that through movement, conquest, mobility of people, etc., where the lack of a space for Muslims brought them into a Greek Orthodox church to pray with the Greeks, and then it became the modus operandi. So in situations like that, Muslims and Greeks, Armenians and Muslims often shared sites and defined themselves again, not in strictly identitarian, but in terms of crossing boundaries and fluidity of who they were. In the transition to the nation state, we know one of the things that happened is, in Roger Brubaker's terms, was the unmixing of peoples that played havoc with displaced communities. Since in empires, attachment to land was a local bond of belonging without an identitarian imaginary, as we understand it today, we would think that those population transfers might not have been so sorrowful and anguished, but they were. The population exchange between Greece and Turkey, for example, which was agreed to 1923, so 100 years ago, was a political agreement that both governments wanted to because both governments wanted to safeguard homogeneity and make homogeneous nations. However, it uprooted 1.6 million people from their communities and sent them across the Aegean into new lands that they had no experience with. And in fact, people say 1.6 million, and that is not correct, because before, when Izmir, when the Atatürk's armies actually went west and attacked the Greek armies that had come post-imperial breakdown and post-World War I, there was an incredible also massacre in Smyrna, and Smyrna was burned, and people moved then too. So we had population movements before that. So, but what we hear about Greeks, and I've looked a lot at the materials and kind of what Greeks have written or told, the stories, the narratives of Greek people who went from Turkey, from the Ottoman Empire to Greece, these fine-grained analyses of the Greeks who moved to Greece show that they were attached to their communities, they were attached to their Turkish neighbors, they were attached to the land they occupied, and they had great difficulty in adapting to a new country. They described Anatolia as the land of milk and honey, and talked about all of the public spaces and the public events that brought them together with their Muslim neighbors. They never talked, there is no discussion of empire, the Ottomans, or how the Ottomans were, or the region even. There is very specific local information about getting along. So the nation state obviously played havoc with that. The transformation from diversity and how many minutes I have? Oh, okay. You're not counting. I'm not counting either. So the transformation from diversity and hierarchy to uniformity and direct, in quotes, equal membership promotes the close identification of a cultural community with a territorial domain and the pride in achieving a unique community. Often we forget that part of nationalism. There is an emotive power to the fact that identity is defined not just culturally but territorially. As a result, many have defined nationhood as a cognitive, affective, and a discursive category. The nation-state strives to maintain fixed and secure borders to contain, the borders from the entry of migrant populations and remain uniform in the ethno-religious dimensions. Attachment to place, I want to argue, in the nation-state is also experienced at multiple societal levels. In a sense, yes, it is the state that tells and that establishes the one state, one people, we are a community, but then people themselves also live at the level of the quotidian. They live nationalism, they live attachment to the state. And national identity and attachment to place are very much part of the everyday interactions between especially majority and minority communities when there are still minorities left in the nation state. So returning, for example, to the example of the shared sacred spaces, there are still today shared sacred spaces in Turkey that have continued from the Ottoman Empire. But because of the national contestation over between majorities and minority populations, majorities define themselves, the Sunni Muslim majority defines itself as the dominant historical national subject. And they enter the sacred space that is owned by the minority, that is the church, with claims of ownership, because they are the Sunni majority. So for them, benefiting from miracles and other resources is a right of nationhood. The reverse rarely happens. So while some commingling brings about, shared communities and, understandings between communities, and I'm the first one to accept that, this notion that Muslim pilgrims always define this space as theirs by association with the fact that they are on Turkish national soil makes the Greek minority incredibly uncomfortable, and the priests very, I'm finishing, and the priests very worried about how to deal with this large group that comes into the sacred space. So I can't obviously elaborate many other cases that I talked about, but in the paper I mean. The Sikh community in Canada is an example of another type of attachment to land that is directed toward India, yet with the political claim of an independent Khalistan. And this you have now, I'm just saying it because all of this happened recently, and for a vocal minority in Canada who have actively pursued the establishment of a homeland on Indian territory, this attachment is like both to India and to Canada, and it's an entangled attachment. So I want to finish by saying, you know, there are distinct forms of attachment to land. There are intertwined or entangled forms of attachment to land, and there are also competing attachments to land. So all of in the nation state, and we have to, in a sense, do a lot of work to unpack these and to think about them in historical and comparative terms. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Professor Barkey for providing us with such a lucid, panoramic vision of pre-modern empires and modern nation states, and the different ways they engendered attachments to place. I can't think of a better way to start a colloquium like this than with the categories and the language she's given us. My response will highlight some of my big takeaways from your talk and extend some of your insights to the South Asia region, which I work on, and pose a few broader questions for us to ponder. Your paper describes an ethos of mixture, fluidity, and communal coexistence expressed in early modern Ottoman, Habsburg, and Russian empires, and how this was eclipsed by the nation-state and its need for homogeneity and territorial sovereignty. Nations in your narrative engender cognitive, affective notions of place and belonging, but they do so only after convulsive historic transitions where people are displaced, transferred, uprooted, and repatriated, often to live perpetually as marginalized minorities. As Professor Barkey observes, people formed very real attachments to localities in the Ottoman Empire. Those attachments were not accompanied by a desire to exterminate or expel the other. The overarching question I want to pose is whether it is possible to whether it is at all possible to retrieve the virtues of this earlier era, or whether life within the nation-state has forever sealed us off from these earlier, less competitive attachments to place. Does the question itself presume an unwarranted romanticization of the past? But let's put that one on the shelf for now and pay closer attention to the historical transition that Professor Barkey has described. We learned, for example, that certain forms of social clustering and segregation flourished, nurtured a sense of place among certain communities. The ghettoization of Jews or Greek minorities in Anatolia, Tunisia, or Venice were not experiences of exclusion or alienation, but became opportunities for cultural preservation, rootedness, and religious expression. We learned as well that traditional land-based empires rested lightly on nomadic tribes residing near the frontiers, and afforded them more opportunities for local autonomy and the preservation of their way of life. Smaller units of social identity were not bulldozed by majorities and their cultural will. This is because attachment to place was not at its heart framed in terms of strong sectarian identities. Finally, Professor Barkey observes that religion under empire was a metaphorical place in which attachments are created and deepened, but not in a way that excludes the other. The regime of the nation-state, however, introduced these invidious majority-minority distinctions, which introduced the element of Muslim majority owning the religious sites of the minority, as in the case of the Greek churches in Istanbul that she just described. Allow me to conclude my response to this very evocative paper with one comment and two questions, very broad questions, hopefully that you can speak to or all of us can chime in on. Professor Barkey presents the population transfer between Greece and Turkey as an example of the nation-state's fixation on cultural or religious homogeneity. I want to extend that example to the partition of the Indian subcontinent, only about 20 years later, and the creation of the independent states of India and Pakistan. Here, the transition is not from the mixtures and soft differences of empire to the purity of the nation, but rather from the creation and ordering of difference that happened under British rule, the policies of classifying people in the census, in the legal systems, in quotas, etc., that the apparatus of the British imperial state was an engine of this formation of monolithic identities. And so you have the almost predictable bloodshed that inaugurated nationhood. So it appears that British imperialism can't be contrasted with the nation in ways that Ottoman imperialism can. On the contrary, it actually set the stage for the Islamizing and Hinduizing tendencies of South Asian nations. Much has been said about the role of states, but what about the role of markets in capitalism? This is my second question. In facilitating transitions that alter our sense of place. It's one thing to speak of the nation as an intrusive leviathan that is fixated on cultural purity. What about the ordering of space enacted by industrial capitalism and its global influence? Finally, in Professor Barkey's narrative, what ends the more tolerant regime of empire is the catastrophic violence of World War I that brings the whole show to an end, and the turbulent transition to homogenized nations. So what would it take to retrieve the virtues of soft difference of this earlier imperial era? How can state policies depoliticize powerful group identities or diffuse rightist ideologies of blood and soil that have become so prevalent today? Or, if it took a catastrophe to inaugurate our international order, is the only hope for change tied to another post-catastrophic order following the twilight of the nation-state? Thank you once again, Professor Barkey, for such a provocative paper for getting us going.
Thank you very much for your comments, and so a few things to say about your ending sentence is really important because soft difference and the depoliticizing of identity would create, something like empire, because the key to empire was that these identities were not really politicized. You were you, I have my religion, you have your religion. We understood that, but we didn't see it as a contentious and competing identity. It happened from time to time, and when it happened, local authorities or the state made sure to nip it in the bud, as Americans say, and to stop it from spiraling in many ways. So that was another thing. But today, identity is politicized. It's not just politicized, it's mobilized. It's all the time mobilized. And that's, to me, the biggest problem of the contemporary world in which we live, is that we carry our identities on us constantly, and we are very much bound to these identities, and it colors the way we see our personal connections. All our networks are in a sense affected by the fact that we live with our identities in a mobilized fashion. So that's very true. one thing I didn't actually say, and when you talked about partition and the British Raj, it reminded me that I should have also said that in the case of the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, one of the things at the end of those empires was actually to order those communities, was to organize through census and to make communities legible and name them. Post-Tanzimat Turkey, Ottoman Empire was about, becoming like Europe and doing everything that Europe had done and espousing also this model of nationhood. There were other models, in the other, there at the end of the empire, there was a very liberal, pluralist group that of elites that really fought very hard to not give up the imperial diversity. They lost out because there was war and because the CUP, the Young Turks, wanted to centralize, and they had the War of Independence, and the liberals got named as traitors at the end, but they wanted still that option. So the nation-state option is also something that we inherited very powerfully from the West and thought that that was the way to go. That was fixation, the Atatürk's fixation, So, yeah.
Are there any
The
questions
questions,
from the audience? This is the time to pose one. Yes, please. We have a mic that we can bring over to you.
No, but I wanted to see the person, that's why I thought.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I wanted to sort of first, oh sorry, my name is Finnegan, I'm a law student, one of the research fellows. In James Joyce's Ulysses, in the chapter on nationalism, a character asks Leopold Bloom, what is a nation? And Leopold Bloom says a nation is the same people living in the same place. I guess my question for you is is there a looser conception of nationhood that you would argue that we could move towards? It seems like nationhood, nation states, and empire are sort of these two contrasting forms. Is there something that's more flexible that you see as being an alternative to that?
Thank you. Actually, I wouldn't completely separate them with very rigid boundaries. There is continual now. There are, Yugoslavia looked more like an imperial entity. I mean, there is always this mixing between the two. But now I forgot what your question was. Is there another way of conceptualizing? Yeah, there is a pluralist way of conceptualizing the nation. And that, would mean that Israel would not think of itself as a Jewish state, but would incorporate Palestinians and figure out a new identity for itself. That Turkey would accept that the Kurdish people are an integral part of this of Turkey, and that they have rights and they should have cultural rights and linguistic rights. That Alevis, who are not Sunnis, are also part of the nation. That the remnants of the Greeks and Jews and Armenians are part of the nation. They speak Turkish, they are, so a pluralist version of the nation is not impossible, to use the double negative. It's not impossible. In many, many places, in the West and the non-West, there is a lot of diversity still, because these places come from diverse empires, no? So why not get rid of the notion of, one state, one people, one land, and formulate, and the millet system, those federated states, all of that it's an opening for us, to think about that a little bit more inclusively. And there are people who are thinking about that. I think we have a question. No?
Processing.
processing, and then you're gonna. Yeah, I know what you're gonna do.
Time for more questions? Yeah, Kelvin.
Gary, thanks for the talk. It's really great. I have a question, perhaps regarding sort of an observation I have. Now that you spoke of dysphoria, metaphor, in times of revolution and political unrest, what I noticed from my experience back in 2019, 2020 in Hong Kong, is that there's a very almost natural urge or instinctual urge for people to search for this identity, either in the form of the more rigid type that you described in nationalism, or sort of not as rigid, but still they're trying to find something, they're trying to hang on to it. And it's very important for them because they're fighting an enemy and they're trying to understand, like, this is my uniqueness.
Yes.
And then, so from this like temporal unfolding point of view, in an imaginable world where after revolution, like there's a new state, it's just quite difficult for me to see sort of after the revolution that can be an openness as porous as you would imagine it, or as you want it to be inclusive, because that's precisely what brought them to those moments of conflict, and that's what kept them together, so to speak.
Well, you're describing the situation after all revolutions, not that they become the revolutionaries who win and who establish the state are the ones that take revenge on the others and are the most rigid. Yes, but we can imagine another, and today we have so many other issues than our own personal religious or ethnic identity. There are, the environmental issue. There's so much that needs to be done. I mean, I tell my students all the time, think bigger. Just move on to the real issues rather than your, and I might be attacked for this, but your gender identity or your he, she, what people write in their thing now. There's a lot to be done. And I think we can imagine, I want to be positive about this. We can imagine something that is larger than our small identities. I mean, they're not really small. I shouldn't say that. But those identities that we hold closest to us.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I think that with the Supreme Court decision on students for fair admission, we are forced into thinking of new categories and new ways, whether we want to or not. But please join me in thanking Karen and our next panel, led by Natana Delongas and Mohamed Hassas and Professor Charles Maier, to this speech. And then
we are very fortunate to have in our second panel two speakers who will be addressing issues from different perspectives. First, we'll hear from Charles Maier, who is the Emeritus Leverett Salas Professor of History at Harvard University. He previously served as the Director of the Center for European Studies at Harvard and currently co-directs the Leverett Initiative in Global History. He's also held a wide variety of visiting appointments and fellowships at universities across the world, including the École des Études Sciences Sociales, Luis University of Rome, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He specializes in European and international history. Among his publications are many scholarly articles and books, most recently Once Within Borders, Territories of Power, Wealth, and Belonging since 1500, as well as Recasting Bourgeois Europe, Stabilization of France, Germany, and Italy in the decade after World War I, In Search of Stability, Explorations in Historical Political Economy, The Unmasterable Past, History, Holocaust, and German National Identity, dissolution, the crisis of communism and the end of East Germany, Among Empires, American Ascendancy and its predecessors, and Leviathan 2.0, Inventing Modern Statesmen. Obviously, Professor Maier has many interests and will hopefully share some of those ideas with us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Maier.
Stand for this and thank for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Jonathan, and Nicholas, co-organizers for this. It was very stimulating course for teaching this conference. I called this paper Two Forms of Attachment, the Power of Place and the Discipline of Territory. Since much of what has been said, actually, what I was going to say, I will try and add.
That's such a compliment.
Well, it's like add a little problem for us to think about. But now let me start with territory and place. Both spaces on the surface of the globe, both one of the many terms we use to describe locations on Earth. Some of those are geographical coordinates, latitude, longitude, north, south, etc. Others are contrasts that locate the speaker on Earth, home and abroad, to take an obvious pair. And that's an obviously emotionally laden contrast. Recall Sir Walter Scott's play of The Last Minstrel. I don't know if anybody reads Scott anymore, but it's lovely. Breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, "This is my own, my native land," whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as all his footsteps he hath turned from wandering on a foreign strand. Other categories are less directly opposed, but have significant connotations, even if they refer to the same piece of land. And I'm thinking of territory and place. And that's the pair I want to propose to explore today. They both relate to segments of global surface. They both signify locations in global space and terrestrial space. But they come with different powers of orientation, different frameworks of meaning. It's not that one is good and the other bad. Each has a potential for constructive social action, and each has a potential for destructive human relations. And the issue is how we work with them. The theme of this study is exception attachment to place. It applies directly the emotional freight that the idea of place may carry. Whether Walter Scott's my own, my native land, or the concept of homeland, the German term Heimat, these terms convey the power of place. Sometimes the French patrie or the Italian patria suggests the same emotional content. But the place does not have to be a nation. It was just that the mid-19th century writers and artists found homeland the most compelling place, the nation, the most compelling place they yearned for or described. But all sorts of places served as sources of emotion. Above all, I'm longing, whether Washington Irving's Hudson Valley, Stephen Foster's Dixon, another artificial place, Theodore Fontana's Prussia, or William Butler Yeats's Ireland, just to cite places in the Western world. Place was a site of emotional rootedness and, of course, a component of identity, along with language and religion. And in this sense, place can be considered what I call an identity space. Think, however, of another identifying term, also a basic description of location, that is territory. What is a territory? A place can be a territory, both places and territories can be states. The territory suggests a bordered space. The border is crucial. It's been enclosed by a boundary and sometimes given a legal status. Territory controls the space needed to build institutions on which to base taxation, investment, political representation. I think of territory as an authority space. A fortified frontier in Europe developed from the 14th century on helped give form to these territories. Territories can enjoy sovereignty, that is, they are subject to no other superior authority unless they delegate certain rights, say as in trade treaties. This quality is what we suggest, sometimes somewhat misleadingly, as Westphalian sovereignty, a status in international law supposedly confirmed in the treaties of Westphalia in 1648. Nations and states, therefore, are particular types of territory. Having a world of multiple states is the defining condition of global politics. It is really difficult to think of territory without it. This means that those in charge of governing a territory try to control who enters and sometimes who leaves. We know that there is often conflict over the border. It took several treaties with the British and Canadians and a war with Mexico to establish the borders of the United States. Border disputes lead to war. Think of this centuries-long conflict over disputed borders of Alsace-Lorraine, transferred back and forth between France and Germany, according to who won the most recent war. There are territories smaller than countries, and the boundaries can be informal. Think of urban gangs who seek to control a particular area. We sometimes use the term turf for this sort of informal territorialization. We know that certain species of animals are highly territorial. Territory is preeminently a political concept, and it implies potential conflictuality between countries as in geopolitics, or the edge of countries by securing boundaries against migrants, for example. Control of borders against migrants has become one of the most sensitive political issues in both the United States and Europe, and I will return to that in a minute. The United Nations Treaty of 1948 supposedly guarantees the right to leave a territory and to return to the same territory, but not to enter another territory. The international migration regime is thus asymmetric. The right to leave a country is enshrined, as was recognized even during the Cold War by the Helsinki Accords in 1975, but there is no right to enter. Obviously, there are strong forces that try to overcome borders. Capitalism is one, and the major expression of capitalism that seeks to overcome borders we have termed globalization. But globalization and international industry and finance are not forces that fundamentally oppose territory. Rather, they have taken territorialization as a given and sought to build on it with plans for national development. Remember the Tennessee Valley Association, national railroad and highway networks are interesting. Or they sought to overcome it by making territories become more encompassing, whether through customs unions or federal attempts like the European Union and the North American Free Trade Agreement. Religion is another force that transcends territory. Think of missionary activity or the Crusades. Christianity teaches that love should transcend boundaries. The Jesuits who built this university arrived in India and China centuries before they got to Brighton. This is a more human vocation. Pope Francis has summoned all of us, rightly I believe, to build bridges, not boundaries. But faith sometimes feels the need for exclusive control over space, that is, over territory. This is what Karen was talking about. The Catholic monarchs of Spain expelled Jews and Muslims in 1492. Protestants and Catholics resorted to territorial separation after a century of conflict and bloodshed between the 1520s and the 1640s. The Cardinal Archduke of Salzburg expelled Protestants to the horror of enlightened Europeans in the early 18th century. Historically, from the late Middle Ages on, the structuring of territory in global space became bound up with the advance to today's modernity. Modern ballistics and gunpowder led to the construction of fortresses in the 16th and 17th century, or to advances in cartography, to the development of national statistics, then to the railroad, and advances in penetration to penetrate territory. Territoriality has become a major political issue of our era. On the one side are those who wish to extend it to overcome it. We call and sometimes cosmopolitans. On the other side are those who wish to reinforce it. One British author has referred to the somewheres and the nowheres. The parties which all populist work to strengthen the territorialized world. And place, I submit, is different. Place is different. It is centered and leaves the border relatively undefined. It is not about power, politics, geopolitics, or legal structures and institutions. It is about emotional connections to local sites and the globe. It is an emotional and not a legal framework. Rather than have a clear border, its geometrical representation should be what mathematicians would call an attractor. That is a familiar and repetitive order. In this conference, it refers to the attraction of place. Think of the pendulum. Place tends to leave a warm and fuzzy feeling. Fenway Park is enclosed, but it is a place, not a territory. Unfortunately, the reality of place can be different, which is why we cannot simply downgrade territory and surrender to the homey charms of a place. The people who cherish a place can be intolerant, they can feel threatened, they can become violent. They cherish other styles of identity that call for exclusivity. They can seek to territorialize place by violence. Remember Bosnia, Rwanda, and Israel. I remember once, perhaps almost 50 years ago, taking a taxi from LaGuardia Airport into Manhattan, or maybe it was from Manhattan to LaGuardia, but we passed through the section of Queens called Astoria, with 1 to 2 family houses. It looked a little like Boston, perhaps. And the driver told me it was his home. And I asked, I said, it's mostly Greek American, isn't it? And he said yes, and he praised the great sense of community it possessed. How was the community preserved? Well, he told me if a black family wants to move in, we threaten to bomb their house. This too, alas, is attachment to place. The remedy for the violence of attachment to place in religion has sometimes been partition, not expulsion, and sometimes exchange of populations. The Treaty of Lausanne a century ago, which is cited, provided that the Muslims of Greece, localized mostly in northern Thrace, must be settled in the new Republic of Turkey, making only movable property, while the Christians in Turkey must relocate to Greece. Notice that was a treaty in which these parties were defined by religion, not We might also cite the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who summed the role of place as being in the world. Heidegger emphasized the Greek city-state of Polis, or the forest clearing of where the inspiration for art arrived like sunbeams through the trees. Heidegger was a philosopher of place, but alas also an ardent Nazi sympathizer who urged the University of Basel and Jews. Even less pernicious, place can be transformed into the archaic or the folklore. How do we keep place a site for authentic and tolerant people, and not living out just the source of the archaic folklore or worse, the lynch mob, arsonists? I don't have a ready answer. I do worry about maybe empire to greater contrast as to this idea. Empires, it's been defined, are institutions to manage difference, but they are managing inequality as well as much as difference. Now, we cannot build a global history or sociology on place and territory alone. There is another important variable that has influenced the role they played, and that is social class. When I wrote my 2016 book, Once Living Borders, territories of power, wealth, I took note of the attractiveness of territorial allegiance and attachment to place, and found very specific class attitudes and locations. Let me recapitulate very briefly what I wrote. Those those who tend to occupy the supervisory positions in politics and the economy, in the digital world, the NGOs, the research universities, claim to transcend it. They aspire to make it elitist, deriving in real power over their activities and symbolic power as well. When they refer to territory, they think of strategic micro-locations, Wall Street, the City of London, Singapore, or the Cayman Islands. The archipelago capital, not the land-mass of territory, is their geographical reference. Professional bonds replace territorial loyalties. Their spheres of interaction are not special. This does not mean that they have contempt for social segmentation. Their nonchalance about territorial loyalty takes for granted their capacity to wall themselves off, poor and dark-skinned intruders. But for those who produce commodities and manufacturers and contribute to the less exalted services, administrative, military, and custodial, territory remains an important use of the structure of personal security in the world. The protection they derive from borders is fragile, sometimes even illusory. They feel dependent on them. Their sense of ethnic identity is more believed, and they find political spokesmen who articulate their own views. They seek to re-territorialize, to rebuild the walls and borders. Next year's presidential election in the United States may well decide along the lines of that vision. I do not know what sort of political programs will draw from these categories. At the end, place and territory are categories that both overlap and oppose each other. They share the property of geographical determination. They are locations. Each of them serves as a sort of spatial anchor or spatial reassurance. They tether us to some place on spaceship Earth, so we are not cast adrift in the universe. Place can give us the comfort of community, togetherness, the familiar, the expectation of returning home. The theme of so much yearning ever since Ulysses labored to reach it. Territory can provide the reassurance of a legal framework, the site for protecting our kinfolk and property, for securing law and order. But it can accommodate preparing for the greater global cooperation that we need to adopt, for instance, to climate change, rising waters. Place draws to cite the sacred cores of memory. Territory provides assurances as to the future, but even as they both give us a sense of rootedness, there remain challenges for our global future. And now I'd like to raise one question at the end that was before listening to previous speakers. I was going to stop here. I'd like to return to this question on the agenda of what I call the asymmetrical regime of migration. The fact that we are all truly bound to let people exit and to return to the same territory, but not to enter. We face this in it's a collective action problem. We faced it in 1938 and 1940 at the conferences of Buda and Avian that were trying to deal with Jewish response. Can we live with an asymmetric regime? That climate becomes more and more drastically desiccated. Is there no way we can overcome this collective action? I think we need an obligation. Refugees have become, in a sense, a country in themselves, a nation in movement, without borders, and without social services, adequate social services. And I'm just like to keep on your agenda. To have wealth, to have nationality is a privilege that we enjoy all the time. We meet the obligations in as far as that. Might we be able to think about the migrant population, which will only grow? People should not despair. In some way where we might have an agency that can distribute them among the places. So when they arrive in Lampedusa, Germans, Italians, they say, who's going to take these people besides us? And I hope there are times when we have to go beyond both territory and place. Maybe not monetary
adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science at Luis Caro University in Rome, Italy, and senior research fellow at the FSCIRE Foundation for Religious Studies, Giovanni 22 in the Field Research Library in Islamic History and Sciences. He holds a PhD in political theory from Luis University of Rome. He's previously served as a research fellow at Babylon Center for the Study of the Multicultural Society of Tilburg in the Netherlands, at the Center for European Islamic Thought at the University of Copenhagen, and as a visiting research fellow at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and as a guest scholar at Leibniz Museum Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. So join me in welcoming Professor Lachas.
I'm very pleased to join you in this event. Maybe I would go on the suggestion of Professor Maier and propose maybe something beyond territory and place, and maybe space could be something to think of, which is larger than space, but at the same time it has space and territorial connotations. Can we think of the Mediterranean as space? Can we think of the Mediterranean as an overlapping civilization, or to overcome certain issues that the nation state and before the empire or empires issues that have to do with ethnicities, with religions, with conflicts? Can an overlapping civilization be a replacement? Or a concept through which we can think these issues over. It is from these questions, as broad as they are, that I thought of Islam in the Mediterranean and its relations with Europe and the larger West for this communication here. And what I presented is a synthetic reading of literature that has been growing on how Islam is seen, or how it sees itself in the Mediterranean and in relations with Europe in particular and the West at large. So what I will be doing is that I will outline these four, what I could consider as narratives in the literature, and I will end up with certain reflections, again, based on the literature produced by Middle Eastern, mostly the Arab world, and Muslim Arab thinkers, and how they look at this Mediterranean space, sometimes without naming it, but they think through it and within it, in relation with Europe. So these four narratives are Islam versus Europe narrative, Islam and Europe narrative, Islam in Europe narrative, and beyond Islam and Europe narrative, by extension, West. Islam versus Europe narrative thinks within incompatibility lenses, or using incompatibility lenses. These two worlds are apart, seen in a way that Islam is religion and Europe is a cultural geographic quality, but they are for Orientalistic tradition still lives, and we are still using the label. But that's one. Second point is that Islam here is considered civilization, and Europe is also here looked at as civilization, but still the nomenclature is not adequate. The literature for the last 30-40 years, at least, has contributed to that. Huntington's text is one text. Bernard Lewis, parts of the reading of Bernard Lewis are put also in this category. And then you have Islam and Europe. And this is a literature that has grown, taking into account migration flows, the new presence of Muslims in Europe from the mid-80s. And it has, for now, it is full discipline in the field of so-called Middle Eastern, but not only. So the Middle East is considers Europe as another space where the Islamic productions of Islamic work take place, and Europe, in that sense, is considered within this frame. I can refer to the historians like Richard Willett, a very short but very interesting text, The Case for the Islam of Eastern Europe, 2004, in which he speaks about nearly 800 to a millennium of relations between the North and South of the Mediterranean, and calls for reviving that tradition of exchange. Maurice Thorper, the Dutch, the British, Danish Nielsen, or Olivia Waugh in that sense, and the major senior scholars that have produced interesting texts on Islam and Europe, including here, Justin Cesari and Jonathan Roberts. Then you have within the same line Islam in Europe, it tries to bring theology studies into spectrum and philosophy, the growing philosophical texts that are produced by the new Europeans, the Muslims of Europe, those who have grown up in Europe during the last 70 years or so. But this narrative, Islam in Europe, tries to say that the new Europeans leave aside Middle Eastern issues, and they try to think within the Western sphere, within modernity, and they consider Islamic tradition as part of this Western sphere. And then they have another narrative, which is also in which historians have contributed so far, which is what I refer to as beyond Islam and Europe narrative, and the Western narrative. And the major work of Marshall Hudson, The Adventure of Islam, in 3 volumes, 74, or his 4th volume posthumously published, Rethinking World History. He reads Islam within this as a world religion and a tradition that belongs to this larger Mediterranean that has continuity with previous traditions, Abrahamic and also non-Abrahamic traditions. And here I can cite other scholars. But my point behind referring to this is to say this narrative by scholars in the Western sphere, it has echoes also in the Arab Islamic world, but the Mediterranean part of the Arab world, North Africa and Middle East. And here we can distinguish between 3 major narratives, which can be synthesized into further 2 if certain elements of difference are beside. They have the Arabo-Islamic centrists, the Arab-Islamic tradition is different, and its particularity has to be maintained and it defines itself in contradistinction with, or in opposition to the West, the way the Western narrative of Islam versus West identifies itself. So it's kind of also a reply to this narrative. And then you have liberal or Europeanist narrative within these scholars, and it was strong until the interwar period. Until the Second World War, this narrative weakened, and it's reviving itself after the Arab Spring. For various reasons we can get going. This Europeanist or liberal narrative was led mostly by the Egyptian university in the first half of the 20th century. And the Egyptian university was very dynamic, very productive, and influential in the Arab world. And Tahir Hussein is one example. He's considered the dean of Arab letters, but he contributed to other fields. And he situated He has an interesting text published in 1939, The Future of the Culture in Egypt, where he situates Egypt as the nation state, or also a state nation in broader Mediterranean history, from its pharaonic periods, its contact with the Greek world, with Romans, and then Arabic, Islamic, and modernity. And he says this plurality has to be enshrined and contained and spoken about in speaking about culture in Egypt and its identity, instead of focalizing only the Arab Islamic, which is late comer. And between brackets, this narrative has also emerged in the rest of other Arab countries, especially the countries that are not modern nation states or created recently or during the last 100 or last 250 years. But the countries that they have built kind of certain state nation narrative, like Iraq or Syria, and also Morocco in that sense. And then you have the third narrative, is the Mediterranean narrative. And this narrative tries to go beyond these two, either Arab-centrist or very liberal Europeanist perspective. And the Algerian French Mohamed Akoun is one of the figures that have contributed to this. But all the contemporary so-called liberal and progressive thinkers of the Arab world could be put into this narrative. So, included in this is the scholars that are very critical of religious movements, of course, and are use double critique. They are critical of Western hegemony, but at the same time they are critical of the way political Islam has reduced identity for plurality of identities in the region. So within these remarks, can we think of an overlapping civilization? Where do I bring the term from? I borrow it from, I borrow it from Brodel in his trilogy, published in 1949, a book from the Mediterranean and in the age of Philip II. And he speaks of overlapping civilizations in the plural. When speaking about the choice that Spain had to take after taking back the territories, it had to choose either the east or the west, according to Brodel, and it chose the west, and that's it means that's the consequences of that choice was to the expulsion, but also the cultural annihilation of that period of 8th century that other historians speak of as very multicultural space. You know, in the Ottoman Empire in the east, but there is Andalus or Iberian period for about 8 centuries that is, by so many historians, a multicultural space. So my time is the time. These are reflections on the Mediterranean as a space. Space as the imagined place and territory in which various traditions that claim to belong to the same sources but at the same time diverge. So, but can this thinking solve the concrete issues of the nation state, or is it a concept or a thought to at least leave on the table for positive optimistic thinking? Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. We'll also have the microphone on I'm really struck by the variety of ideas that we have presented here as we're thinking about space and place and territory. We hear about emotion, we hear about belonging and not belonging, and what does it mean to belong. Thinking about meaning. I thought many times about Benedict Anderson's work on imagined communities. I have to raise the question about the degree to which, when we're thinking about connections to places and territories and spaces, we might also be thinking about imagined memories, as odd as that might sound as a concept. There's a tendency sometimes to romanticize or to imbue a particular place or history or location with certain ideas that we hold dear, with emotion. And I would invite us to think about some of the priorities that have been outlined for us in thinking about places. Are we thinking about the priority of security, which is what we tend to hear about here in the United States? Are we thinking about the priority of connection to family? Are we thinking about the priority of boundaries, who gets in and who stays out? Are we thinking about power dynamics? But we also think about, and this is part of what Danielle was referring to in thinking about the Mediterranean as a region, at least in my training in world history, is to think about human exchanges and human interactions. And must they be limited by boundaries or memories or places or spaces, or are we at a moment in time where we need to think a little bit more expansively? And I think that's what Charles was inviting us to consider at the end, is we are living in a time where we have so many more refugees for a variety of reasons, because they are fleeing from violence. We are expecting to see an increasing number of climate refugees in the future, as some places become uninhabitable and some places cease to exist altogether. The Prime Minister of the Maldives, for example, decided to host a press conference underwater in scuba gear to raise the point that his place was disappearing altogether. And what were they going to do with people who simply would no longer be able to live in their homes? Are there ways in which we might be able to think beyond countries and empires and states, to think about regions, and perhaps to develop new narratives? And so my closing question here would be, how do we learn to think about attachment to place as a memory or imagined memory in a time of where we live increasingly in detachment from spaces we have known? So I'll throw that question to our speakers and see if you have any responses to those.
I'm not sure I can answer those questions.
You guys can.
But it does seem to me that we should not, I think you're right about it. We shouldn't fetishize memories, which may romanticize experiences. And I was thinking of Karen, you talked about the Venice ghetto. I remember being there as a student in April '61, and being invited into a Seder at the Passover time. It's a beautiful architecture, the synagogue. But after all, it's also the site for the Merchant of Venice, which is not a very happy tale on either side. So I think probably we're going to have, I think the European Union is a hopeful way of thinking about things. The United States is so large, wealthy, that it hasn't had to think about these things. But I do think we're going to, think about the Maldives, the wet places, places that are too wet, places that are too dry, places that are just right. The Goldilocks lands, although there are fewer of those, and even today they get rained on heavily. that's really hard. It's especially hard when geopolitics cuts across it. I mean, if we are constantly preoccupied by a rivalry with China. So these are real. I mean, these are the stuff as a historian I've always dealt with historically and think about all the time. But I look at those photographs of Somalia drying up, and so I think we're just going to have to conceptualize our world differently in some sense. I'm not going to be around long enough to do that, but other people here will have to do that. So I'll leave it at that.
What shall I add? I think for cultural issues about the Mediterranean and this idea of mutual understanding from civilizational perspective, if we can get back that concept, I'm using it because also, besides prevailed, I referred to that because of globalization, digitalization of the world, so the world is shrinking, but at the same time people are looking for identity, where to identify themselves, because they are lost in the net, in the web, so they need to identify themselves with something, with the community. So that's where the threat of digitalization or the globalization in general is at the cultural level. And that's why I think religion will have a place all the time, and it will be used all the time. But the question in the Mediterranean in particular, I do think that maybe from an institutional perspective, it looks like helpful to see how things are. But from the cultural perspective, I think there are issues that have to be solved there in the imaginary between the North and South of the Mediterranean, which then North America culturally doesn't have. The issues that link or bring the North America, United States mostly, to the Mediterranean are mostly political and economic. But the cultural issues are actually between the North and South of the Mediterranean. And these have to be fixed in the textbooks. Sociologists and anthropologists and historians reading textbooks of in Western Europe and how the South of the Mediterranean or the immigrant is represented is horrifying. But there has been no change there during the last 20, 30 years. Although the debate is there and tense, etc. I think there is a lot of work to be done there in Western Europe. If I want to stay thinking of the Mediterranean first, as an example, and from that perspective, North African contribution, I think, is only the political choices that has to be done. Where to situate that part of the world, seeing that China was mentioned. I hope we don't go into that again, east-west. I don't know that.
Do we have time for any questions? Or
Time for one question. If someone would like to jump in, yes, Dan Kenstrom, Professor Kenstrom.
I have a question that's grounded in my field, which is law. And it seems to me that this tension between the fundamental human desire for community, identity, autonomy, and the fundamental human need for movement, which becomes desperate in some historical periods, is eternal. It's always been there. It's particularly acute now, but we have seen it before. And it tends to inspire two forms of somewhat magical thinking. One is a kind of utopianism about human rights and about fundamental right to move wherever you want. And the other is a kind of bureaucratic utopianism about could we control it in such a way that we can move people where we need to move them. Both of those I think are legal solutions, but they're static legal solutions, and they're a little absolutist for my taste. And I would suggest that what we're looking at here is a fundamental tension that needs a dynamic dialogical solution to it, and law can provide that. And I just want to give one example, which I would welcome your thoughts about. A few years ago, there was a French farmer named Cedric who was prosecuted criminally for helping migrants who had just crossed over the Pyrenees into France. He was convicted, and he raised a defense, which was unique in French law, of fraternity, that the principle of fraternity precluded criminal prosecution for actually helping people. He won. I think this is a very interesting thing to think about because it's not a perfect solution. It doesn't require abolition of borders. It doesn't necessarily facilitate the state in moving people around, but it provides a sort of tacit crystallization of certain principle that helps us think about more dynamic ways forward that mediate some of these tensions, so that maybe even the irony of like the Biden administration's current policy of having people come in and then tacitly dealing with them in New York and gradually dispersing them is a more dynamic and fluid way of thinking about this. And so I just offer that as a way of using law to think this through.
Thank you.
Maybe there's no time for a response.
It's time for a response.
Fraternity is,
Yes.
what? My wife always wants me to learn to be a rock singer where I keep okay. You know, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I mean, there's good reason that that's there. And yes, it's an obligation, but I guess it would have, you know, it's in some sense you are talking about an accommodation. How we do this, and I am for that. Remember, fraternity can be seized for other, you know, less noble ends. Giorgio Malone's party in Italy is called Fratelli d'Italia. Maybe we should just talk about sorority. Sisterhood, that might be better, but I'm all for accommodations of some sort. If law can help us find them. You know, I don't. These things are not going to be solved in any magical way. You know, they're going to be eased, maybe, or worse, and we just have to work at the limits of what's possible. But I don't think we're at the limits of what's possible.
Thank you very much. And I know for a fact that we will pick up this theme immediately upon our return from the coffee break. So please take 10 minutes to grab a cup of coffee and you'll notice that today's event was broken up into two halves, all two short halves. But the first part on religion, nation, and empire, including attachments to place, and this second part of our program is very aptly dedicated to citizenship and rootedness in place, which is a perfect transition to our speaker this third session. Our speaker is Professor Paul Romer, who is the Maier University professor in the Carroll School of Management at Boston College, where he will direct the new Center for the Economics of Ideas. We are all extremely excited about this new arrival. Paul was a co-recipient of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on the economics of ideas that fundamentally differ from the traditional economics of scarce physical objects. Professor Romer previously taught at NYU, Stanford, Berkeley, Chicago, Rochester, and he created the education technology company that later became Engaged Learning. In addition to his teaching contributions, Professor Romer has served as the chief economist at the World Bank, and he founded NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management, which works to help cities plan for their futures and improve life for their citizens, as well as a city-scale startup called Charter City. His public policy contributions include work with the U.S. Department of Justice and the Singapore Independent Academic Advisory Panel on University Policy, and currently he serves as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, as a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a non-resident at Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, Ontario. It is a delight and an honor to invite Paul up now to deliver some remarks. And he's responding afterward. We have Professor Carlo Barroso of EC Law, but for now, please join me in welcoming
I want to thank Professor Maier for teeing up my subject, because what I told Jonathan I wanted to talk about was the prospect of mass migration. Now, this, I think, raises two interesting questions. The first is, why do so many people want to leave the places where they now are? The Gallup organization estimates that about 700 million people in the world right now say they want to leave if there were someplace where they could go. So why do so many people want to leave? Second question is, why do so many people in the target destination countries, why are they so fearful about the prospect of mass migration? Now, I'll come back to those questions, but before I do, I want to start by just saying that this issue of migration is one which is just fraught with emotion. And my goal is always to try to be dispassionate. What I can offer as an economist is usually through dispassion, logic, and evidence. But in this topic in particular, I want to emphasize that dispassion requires empathy as well. We, as economists, we pay a lot of attention to the distinction between what I like to call what should questions, some people refer to these as normative questions, versus what if questions, positive questions. We have professional expertise only in answering what if. If you do this, then the reaction might be that. What should is something that all of us have to decide, but we draw on other sources besides logic and evidence. We draw on moral notions of what's right and wrong. But I have no professional experience that gives me any place to speak about what's right or what's wrong. I think it's important. I think persuasion about right and wrong is also important, but that's not what I can do. Now, what do I mean by the empathy? Think about the two groups here. There is a group of people who want to go to a new place. It's easy, I think, to have empathy for them. If you just see the pictures of the families and the children, this photograph of the child who died, it just kind of pulls at your heart. But I want us to try and empathize as well with the people who say, we don't want migrants. It's harder to do because they often say that in ways that are ugly, and they're not necessarily, some of those local people are not the most attractive. So when I say empathize, I don't mean sympathize. But I mean empathize in the sense that we've got to understand what motivates them. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? Because then we might have some hope of being able to look at a possibility like, well, what about X? We could try X. Would that work? And if we understand the various parties and how they might react, we can make an assessment about what we might be able to do. So, with all that as preface, I think the answer to both of those questions is about culture and norms. I think people want to leave the places where they now live because they've lost hope that the culture and norms in those places will evolve in the direction or become the kinds of cultures and norms in which they want to live and they want to raise their children. By the way, I meant to say that there is this distinction in international law between economic migrants and refugees. And I think one of the side effects of the empathy is I don't think that's a helpful distinction for this purpose. People who are trying to move because they want their kids to have a good education, because they want them to be able to have a job, they deserve our empathy every bit as much as people who are willing to to escape from political persecution. But what this confronts us with is these numbers that are at the scale of hundreds of millions. So people move because they've lost hope that the culture and norms could evolve in the direction that would give them the chance for a better life that they desire. People who resist immigrants are afraid that the immigrants will undermine the culture and norms that they want to preserve that characterize the places where they live. Now, this suggests that there's a bit of a difference in these perspectives. What is it? Is it that these norms, these equilibria of norms and culture are so hard to change that we have to give up hope about changing the development world? But yet, if they're so hard to change, why are so many other people afraid that they could collapse? So are we dealing with extreme persistence here, or are we dealing with something which is fragile? So let me try to give you my take on this, and I'll do it with a story. As the bio revealed, I clearly can't keep a job. I think I've settled. I've moved around. I taught at Stanford for 15 years or so, and then moved to New York because I wanted to start an institute on cities. When I got to New York, I saw people who were crossing at the crosswalks, even though it said "Don't cross." And unless you've lived in California a long time, you may not realize that California has a very different culture about this. It's not exactly Vienna, but like if it says "Don't cross," you don't cross. So I got there to New York, and I wanted to say to these people, "Hey, don't do that. Wait till it says walk." And now fortunately, my powers of reasoning were sufficient to say, "Paul, there are a lot more of them than there are of you, and this is their place. Just keep your mouth shut. Just bite your tongue." And what was interesting was that visceral reaction, that went away in about 6 weeks. And after about 6 weeks, yeah, well, sure. You're not supposed to interfere with cars, but so I think we have to think of, on these kind of small scales, but potentially bigger ones too, at the individual level, we have lots of plasticity. You put us down in a new place, we kind of adapt and fit in, and that works great. But at the equilibrium level of a group, we have this conformist dynamic where everybody tends to, not everybody, but to a large extent, we tend to do what others around us do. That actually means that it's very difficult to change an equilibrium in these norms. So an equilibrium with many people can actually be more stable than when you have horizontal transmission that's conformist. So people who are peers who transmit values back and forth in a way where they tend to conform. The other model of norms is, of course, parental transmission. Most people think intuitively, well, that's very slow. There's a generational time scale. But I think actually, when you think about the conformist dynamics, it's the thing which really can generate persistence over 8 centuries of a kind we see on certain social phenomena. So horizontal transmission, and plus, if you've been a parent, how much could you change what your kids believe anyway, compared to them talking to their peers? So most of it's got to be, a huge amount of it's got to be peer-to-peer, horizontal, and it's got a tendency to be conformist. Now, the good news about that is that means that one person can move into a new equilibrium rapidly, and if they interact with others, they'll rapidly kind of assimilate or integrate into the new set of norms, and it works potentially very, very well. And when somebody's moving to a set of norms which are better tuned to fit with the world in which we live, that means that they can go someplace that, for example, has notions about pro-social behavior. At least don't impede the cars if you're gonna walk across the crosswalk. And notions about rule following and concern for others, consideration. I love the city, I'm a big student of cities. I love the signs that used to tell people, don't spit, you know, in the city. Because you had to kind of teach people, don't spit. So if there's a sense in which the environment, the technological, economic, social environment changes, or not social, say technological and economic environment changes, there may be, it may be important to have norms and culture that evolve to help guide us towards better outcomes in those new dynamics. And if we have older norms, that we could get stuck in a situation where there's a misalignment between the norms and the opportunities. The particular dimension that I think most people are trying to move to is the rule of law. It's really kind of like follow the street signs, but writ larger. In a big, modern, largely anonymous economic and technological environment, having a system based on the rule of law is very valuable. And it's grounded in respect for those rules that individuals have. It's supported by things like police and prosecutors, but if the population doesn't believe in it in some sense, we know it falls apart. So the rule of law is a very valuable, is based on a very valuable set of norms and the culture related to it. And it's very attractive for many people to try and move to it, even if they feel like, well, sure, I want to cheat on my taxes and I don't want to follow the speed limit all across the street. I still would rather live in some place where everybody else has to follow the rule of law because I won't get robbed and we can do transactions where there's contracts. And so even people who don't feel an attachment to the rule of law, they still want to move to a place that has it. And then when they move there, they get socialized in most of the time, and then they become supporters of this system. The best characterization I've ever heard of what the prospects are in the places that people are leaving is one from Gordon Brown, where he said, in establishing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always problems. He meant that literally. Look at like the Magna Carta and then play it forward, and eventually get a good system. But people are too mobile now, and they're not going to stay in places that lack the rule of law and don't offer the opportunity that the rule of law offers. And wait 5 centuries. So I think there is a pressure that's building for mass migration that even if we didn't have the threat of climate change, it already is very large already, and then climate change will just make it. But I think we have to also take seriously the fact that even though like the assimilation and convergence will find a very small influx of people, as you scale the numbers up, it becomes more problematic. And also if you have a society which isn't as good at, say, integrating people in, then this dynamic of assimilation may not work. And so what you may end up with is like a subculture that reflects the values where people came from. And the people in the country that receive the new migrants are concerned about this. And the flashpoint for this right now in the world is Sweden, where Sweden had 11 murders related to drugs and drug gangs, which is in 1 month, and this is unprecedented in Sweden. The people are bombing the households of their opponents in the drug gangs. And the last Swedish premier who lost the election over this, to the party of the right, even from the kind of the social democrats were saying that this was because we failed to integrate the Somali and other migrants into Sweden. We failed to integrate them into Swedish society. I think part of what's interesting is that they adopted oppositional behavior, like what you see in, say, gangs in the United States, that they didn't bring from their, from their home countries. But, if you feel excluded and you don't have a big stake in society, there is a kind of a pattern that seems to emerge with this kind of opposition. And who knows? Sweden, drugs are a kind of a background threat in every country. Maybe Sweden would have had more murders like this absent the influx. But people in Sweden are certainly attributing this to their decision to bring people in and then not socialize them into the current regime and the rule of law that they took for granted. I, because of this, have made a suggestion that many people think is immoral, and that what should, I think their reaction is you shouldn't even talk about this suggestion, but I think this crisis is too big to ignore. I think the possibility we could consider is the one case historically where we saw millions of people move in and get access to the British system of the rule of law with no backlash from the British, which was in Hong Kong. Britain set up a jurisdiction and said, you can come in if you want. We're going to administer the rule of law the way we administer it in Britain. And if you want to come in and live under those terms, you can. People came in, and they even had data later where they showed that when the rate of influx from, say, southern China was too high. It took a while. They eventually established a very strong equilibrium there, even of no corruption in the police force, no bribe giving. When the rate of influx from China was too high, the incidence of bribery and support for no corruption would go down a little bit. And so they would train people, know it's different when you get here, and they were tracking this and adjusting a little bit the rate of inflow. But basically, Hong Kong worked extremely well, and we know no other case that could take in people at that scale of 5 million, 10 million. So I hope there's a discussion about could we start other new cities and run them like the British ran Hong Kong, where there was an administrator, a governor, who was subject to democratic accountability because the prime minister appointed, removed. It was not a autocracy, but it was not local democracy. And the fact that it was not local democracy, I think, was actually part of why it was succeeding. And there was no demand for local democracy in Hong Kong until suddenly the threat of the takeover by mainland China. So this is a bad idea, but it's better than all the alternatives because no one has an alternative. We could build 100, we didn't get 100, 10 million. We could build 70 cities of 10 million people like Hong Kong and take all 700 million people who want to leave where they are. So I hope we at least consider that as a possibility. And then if someone can come up with something else, which is even better, great. But we need to start taking this challenge seriously because it will overwhelm us if we don't. Thank you.
You're welcome. I would also like to make some remarks in response.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Paul. Let me say a word about meaning, a word about time frame, a word about norms and law, then suggest a case study for analysis. So first, a word about meaning. The investment from poetry, from the arts, from school curriculum in modern times to attach people to policies is extraordinary. I used to think of myself growing up in southeast Brazil as a cosmopolitan soul. I'm not a national flag carrier. That is for those who lack imagination. Then I once went for World Cup game. Was in Germany. Brazil was playing Croatia. Before the game, they show in the stadium the curriculum of the national teams that were playing. My father had already lost it. My brother was screaming, and I was there because my father was so. Right? Then they showed the curriculum of Croatia. Very, very impressive. And the Croatian fans applauding, singing, chanting. And then came the moment of showing the Brazil's team curriculum. 2 minutes later, I was standing on my seat screaming like a crazy person. So the investment in building that meaning is extraordinary. You can bear it, you can tame it, but it's so profound and so serious. Perhaps we should channel the investment in other directions that are less violence causing, less conflict causing, than the investment that we have all made, from poetry to arts to law to educational curriculum. So that's the point about meaning. The point about time frame. So if you look at the end of the 19th century, most people in the city of São Paulo or New York City had not been born in those countries where the cities are located. And then now fast forward, we cannot think of São Paulo without the Italian, Japanese, and Ottoman Empire migrants here in England today. It's just not thinkable. But for the people who were in São Paulo at the time, receiving those waves of migration, and for the people who were forced to migrate there, the stakes was extraordinary, was personal. The time frame was biographical. If we take if we enlarge the time frame to the historical comparative analysis, everything's going to be okay. Your kids are going to marry for decades. Two generations later, your culinary is better, your art is better, your science is better, your government is better, everything's going to be okay. But we live in the biographical time frame. The time frame is informed by this investment in meaning. So that was the point about time frame. Now the point about norms, I think you're right on pointing to the centrality of norms in the enterprise here, and that a solution has to somehow take that viewpoint. Norms do so much for us. They make expectations about the behavior of others tenable, sustainable. It's a gift to go through life, knowing what to expect from your neighbor in the morning when you meet in the neighboring driveways. You know what to say, you know what you're going to get back. And if you sort of expand that notion, it makes life possible. So norms are very important. And here is a case study, Paul, for us to think about. At the beginning of the last century, about 90% of African Americans lived in the south of the United States. 6 decades later, just over half of them live in the south. In those 6 decades, over 6 million African Americans left the south to go to the north. They elected to settle in large cities, New York, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, Cleveland, and other large urban areas. And the constellation of reasons why they left, very much similar to those reasons why people leave today. There was lack of economic opportunity, there was lack of recognition and dignity in social life, there was lynching, and everything in between. Then they arrive speaking the language, with familiarity, They had status, symmetry, they were all citizens, they had to vote the moment they arrived in New York. The next election is a vote, to register and move. And yet, with those cities, failed in the very easy job to tap in human potential, human resources, to give dignified opportunities, and this is in one country. Why did we fail? What is it about migration internally in the United States in that scale that was so much easier to take care of, since the norms were already there provided, that did not work out? So I leave you with that sort of case study and help us think about this.
Let me just say, I think this is a very important case study. I don't think it's really been done, that we should do it. But I think it may well relate to one of the other reasons why I think we should treat the equilibrium with the rule of law as being a little bit fragile. We're familiar with the decline in the crime rate that we saw in, say, the 1990s. What we forget is that there was a parallel rapid increase in the crime rate in the 1960s. And when you think about the taxi driver who said, we'll bomb them because we don't want them to come in, they were afraid that somehow having blacks move in would lead to more crime. And so it's a very complex mix. So we failed not only in failing to provide the right opportunity, but also in letting crime for several decades lead to horrible harm to mostly to poor people. So I agree that we need to study these. We need to study the cases that are also, I think, more optimistic. The other story coming out of the South is the U.S. Army, which is a Southern institution. When the U.S. Army saw that we were going through the transition to the all-volunteer force, they realized they had to manage race relations better because they were a multi-ethnic force and they had to have a multi-ethnic officer corps as well. And they take people routinely from the South who still grow up in relatively racist kind of environments, and they forge them into groups that have what they call unit cohesion. They do it very differently than we approach race relations at a university campus, but they're the one success story. That's the only organization in the United States where black men routinely order around white men. And so anyway, there's possibility for change even at that individual level, but we need to structure it and we need to system.
I would note also that that is the one set of educational institutions that were exempted from the Supreme Court decision over the summer. Which underscores that.
Yeah, I noted that and I wanted to go look at it, but
I saw a hand up here, right here, Karen, and then Ophelia.
I just wanted to ask the question of assimilation, because it feels to me like it's not a given that people who moved into, let's say, Indians or Pakistanis to England, or the Algerians into France necessarily want to assimilate. I think the assumption for you is that they will, Hong Kong was the same ethnicity, so that facilitated, but in the case of very big differences, and the unwillingness sometimes to assimilate into the new polity makes things much harder. And it's hard, I don't know how we deal with that.
I think you're exactly right. That I treated my little model was as if people were just these kind of atoms with no choice. But in fact, people do have a choice. And if and I hinted at this by talking about the groups who get stuck in this culture of opposition, where they're intentionally reinforcing amongst themselves that they're not like them. Some of this, we may not like the answers that we get, but I think we need to find the answers anyway. in the U.S. Army, there's this book that's a very good story about this by, I've forgotten the authors, but it's called All We Can Be. It's by a sociologist, who's the foremost sociologist of the military?
Moscow's?
Moskos, thank you, yeah, Moskos.
All we can.
Moskos and Butler. They tell the story about walking into a cafeteria and then watching, there was a table, I don't know if they even say it, but it was either all white or all black, and a sergeant came up and told half of the men to move. Just, you gotta get up, we don't allow segregated tables in our cafeteria. You know, so in a sense, you know, it may take a little bit of a structure and kind of a, like, for our organization, we don't let you exercise your preference, say, for segregated interaction. So, and this is what we don't do, you know, college campuses. So, I think we should study these with a kind of dispassion and empathy and a clear eye, but, you know, with a view towards figuring out what will work.
Again, very quickly, just a final comment from Ophelia, before we move to our final session.
Hi, Professor. For your talk. My name is Ophelia. I'm a second-year PhD student in the English department at Boston College. My research interest is Asian American literature. So I have a question about your the subject of your research. So you mentioned in your talk, like one attraction of the destination country is culture and norm. And so, but like transnational migrations seem to be primarily motivated by economic reasons.
Well, could I say, I misspoke then, because what I wanted to suggest is that there's economic opportunity made possible by the rule of law, which is grounded in the cultural norms. So people may not be saying, I want those cultural norms, but they may be indeed saying, I want that opportunity.
So I guess my question is like, how is economic factors are situated in your research, and also, for example, like you mentioned, the success of Hong Kong's migration to the UK, and Hong Kong is one of the most prosperous regions in the world, so that would be a factor.
Well, first, what was unique about Hong Kong was that when people moved there, they got a right of abode, but they didn't get a passport. So no one in Britain who might have been worried about kind of somehow British culture or values being threatened was concerned when large numbers of people moved into Hong Kong. I think the huge economic success in Hong Kong is a very optimistic sign of what's possible when you give people the kind of opportunities that something like the rule of law can provide. But I do agree that some people might resent, in a way, having to go to this place where they don't tolerate bribery because they feel like, well, that's the way we always do things, is to issue bribes. They go anyway because they like the opportunity, the economic opportunity. In the best case, they become socialized into and then eventually do appreciate the rule of law and are glad they don't have to issue bribes anymore. But it may take a little bit of structure to engineer that, and frankly, it may take a little bit more enforcement in a place like Hong Kong than say people in Sweden would be willing to tolerate. One of the things I liked in Hong Kong is that the burden of proof was on the police officer to show that you weren't corrupt. If they came in and looked at what your income, your salary was, and then what your consumption was, if you can't prove where that came from, you were fired. You didn't get thrown in jail, but they had a very strict rule because a lot of their corruption was in actually the police force. A lot of their expat Brits actually came there. So, Britain or Sweden, they might not tolerate a police force where you can be fired unless you can prove you're honest. But in the Hong Kong context, that was what they needed to have. So I think you can tailor the institutions in a place like that and encourage the right kind of assimilation. And then, of course, you want to transition to local democracy eventually, but it's just a matter of doing it. And one of the things, democracies never vote in favor of mass migration. So if you let 1 million people into Hong Kong, and then turned it over to local democracy, they would have prohibited the next million from coming in. So you're gonna have to get up to your target scale, let's say 10 million, even before you try to do the transition to local democracy.
Thank you very much, and we're going to we're now going to transition to our final session with Danielle Allen and Professor Aziz Rana of DC Law. Nicholas Yekmota, Center's Assistant Director, will be introducing Danielle.
Good evening, everyone. You're all well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our closing keynote for the evening, Professor Danielle Allen. Danielle Allen is a seasoned leader, an expert in public policy and public affairs, a national voice on pandemic response, and a distinguished academic and author. Professor Allen's work to make the world better for young people has taken her from teaching college and leading a $60 million university division to driving change as board chair for a $6 billion foundation, writing for the Washington Post, and most recently to running for governor of Massachusetts. Currently the James Bryant Conant University professor and director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School's Grant Center, Professor Allen co-chaired the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, formed to explore how best to respond to the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in political and civic life. Its final and bipartisan report, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century, was released in June 2020 and includes 6 strategies and 31 ambitious recommendations to help the nation emerge as a more resilient democracy by 2026, our 250th anniversary. During the height of COVID in 2020, Professor Allen's leadership in rallying coalitions and building solutions resulted in policies adopted in federal legislation and a Biden executive order. It also resulted in her book, Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, which publishers weekly acclaimed as a trenchant call for reimagining how America functions in a time of crisis. Professor Allen is also the author of several further books addressing the broad history and personal significance of justice and democracy, including Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, Cuz, an American Tragedy, and most recently, Justice by Means of Democracy, a major work of normative political theory, about which I suspect we'll be hearing a little bit tonight. Professor Allen is the recipient of the 2020 John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, an award administered by the Library of Congress that recognizes work in disciplines not covered by the Nobel Prizes, as well as a MacArthur Fellowship and honorary degrees from multiple colleges and universities. And responding to Dr. Allen today will be Professor Aziz Rana, Provost Distinguished Fellow and starting in 2024, the J. Donald Manin S.J. Chair in Law and Government at Boston College Law School. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Danielle Allen for our closing keynote.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And just a simple Professor Danielle would have been enough by way of introduction. So, but it's really an honor and wonderful thing to be here with all of you. I appreciate it. You could hear from all of that, so maybe Paul can't keep a job, Danielle can't sit still. Sort of to the lessons there. But this has been a really wonderful and rich conversation. And I'm grateful to come last because it gives me the chance to, in some sense, be responsive to what has come before. And Paul, in opening his remarks, claimed his role as a positivist. Some of you answered if-then questions. I am a philosopher, so I get to claim something about the sort of professional right to answer should questions. So that is what I kind of do, and it was nice because the first few sets of comments all asked a question. And I think it was, can't we have a softer picture of identity, a softer picture of borders and boundaries? And can't we do something about the incoherence of a global framework where there's a right to exit, but no right to enter? And we then have started, with Paul to explore solutions, and also sort of Dan's remark too. I think the case in France is a very specific kind of accommodation for places to be a solution. And it's in that space of solutions that I also have to spend my time What I'm going to do is very briefly introduce you to one of the chapters in this book, Justice by Means of Democracy, came out in the spring. And the chapter 5 in the book is called Polypolitanism. Okay? Now, I generally am not a fan or in favor of academic jargon. I basically tell all my students, never invent jargon and don't use jargon. But I am doing that, all right? I want everybody to learn the word polypolitanism. And I figure that since we all learn cosmopolitanism, it shouldn't be that hard to learn polypolitanism. It means simply, from the Greek of course, being a member of polites of many places. And being a polypolite, so you can be either many places or being literally a member of many polities. Lots of people have been using the phrase attachment to place. I hope we can replace it with the phrase attachment to places. And that, to me, is the beginning of the conceptual shift that we need to address some of the problems we face. So I want to say a little bit more both about what this concept of polypolitanism is and how it came to me to seem really important as a part of a project of trying to make the case for democracy as foundational in human well-being and thriving. That is to say, why is polypolitanism part of the solution to the future of democracy? So, in terms of the concept itself, it basically means each and every one of us is actually already a member of many places. I am a citizen of the city of Cambridge, of the state of Massachusetts, of the United States, of a set of professional associations that span borders that are transnational, of various kinds of digital associations that also span borders. And in all of those spaces, I am subject to governance. It is not the case that I am only subject to national governance. And I have different packages of rights and responsibilities across all of those spaces. So then the question for human well-being is whether or not across the multiple of places that we are members of, do we, through the package of memberships, have access to the voice and empowerment that human beings need for well-being? Now, what does that mean concretely? It means things like, for example, it may be the case that national voting rights are not the end-all and be-all of thinking about voice and empowerment. They are fundamental and fundamentally valuable. I'm not saying anything to undermine that. The point is that when you're thinking about migration, it might be that, as was the case earlier in the 20th century, it's reasonable for migrants to have voting rights at the city level and not the national level, and have a long runway before they have voting rights at the national level. And if you could start to think about that sort of different layers of jurisdictionality, you have many, many more possibilities for how you think about immigrant or migrant incorporation. No longer is everything high stakes, all or nothing membership. And that speaks to the point of accommodation and the concept of fraternity that Dan was raising. So how did this come to seem so important to me? Well, sometime roughly 10 years ago, I think, I don't remember exactly, I read an article in the New Republic at the time. It's got through many variations that journal has. And it was written by an economist named Glenn Weil and a partner of his named Eric Posner. And in some sense, it made some points that were similar to the ones Paul started with, that you have this problem of misaligned incentives in the space of migration. You have receiving countries that aren't ready to do the cultural incorporation, and you have people who want to exit for economic opportunity. And in their case, their argument was really focused on the question of how to reduce global inequality. And the view was, the more migration, the more movement we can have, the better. That's how you would bring economic equality up in the world. But then that runs against the problem of receiving countries fearing cultural breakdown, not wanting to support that. And their solution horrified me. Kind of the way Paul's suggestion that colonialism is the answer should be horrifying on first hearing, right? So their solution was that recipient countries, people in recipient countries, should be able to have the wages of people whom they would sponsor as migrants, putting it very crudely. In other words, a sort of structure of indentured servitude was basically the core idea they proposed. So that then you'd have, in the receiving country, an incentive for people to accept migrants. And I read this, and I was furious, steam coming out of my ears, because, for many reasons I could go into at too much length, I am committed to the idea that human well-being rests fundamentally on empowerment. And so any policy proposal that's dependent on sacrificing access to political equality was for me a non-starter from the get-go. I will spare you all the reasoning behind that for now, but happy to talk about it if you'd like. So because I was so angry, I invited Glenn to the Institute for Advanced Study, where I was a faculty member, for a seminar. That's what I do when I'm angry, so. So I just want to talk some sense into this person, who I had never met. So Glenn came and we had a seminar and we hashed it out, and the result has been a very lengthy intellectual collaboration ever since. He's shifted his views in meaningful ways. I've shifted my views in some ways, but the thing that became very clear to me in that conversation with Glenn was roughly the challenge of the following problem. That for me, I'm making this case that justice, human well-being depends on democracy. That for me means that building a healthy democracy depends on being able to build an empowering economy in that democracy. It requires that rule of law foundation, like the Marshall Plan after World War II, what that provided for Europe. But the problem was that the job in the 21st century is to do that, to build that empowering economy that can support domestic democracy without exploiting people outside your borders, right? Very often, democracy, project of empowerment and egalitarian economic foundations have depended on exploitation. Take the American case. You had actually quite an interesting commitment to an egalitarian economy in the US in the late 18th, early 19th century. Even, for example, giving out land in Georgia, the land lottery, in equal lots to widows and husbands, basically, but heads of household. Where did the land come from? Of course, expropriated from Native Americans. And so that's been the pattern repeatedly, that the kind of egalitarian economy that you needed to hold up a healthy democracy depended on exploiting or expropriating from somebody else. So how in the 21st century could we have the first two things, that just democracy resting on a healthy, empowering economy without exploitation? It requires solving the issue of migration. The first economic fact is the question of how the labor market is structured. The first fact of how the labor market is structured is how membership and boundaries are structured. So at this point in time, because of the contradiction between the right to exit but no right to enter, we have a very unjustly structured labor market. So the question then is, how can you reach a point where you can maximize mobility and migration at the same time as making that compatible with reception internally? And I then added the third criteria, without people losing their access to voice and empowerment. And the result of that set of criteria is this concept of polypolitanism, where you are endorsing the notion that you might use a sponsorship program, and you can think about the Canadian asylum program as being a kind of mini model of what could happen on a bigger scale, or H-1B visas where corporations sponsor people. But you build a sort of civil society expectation a la the fraternity model, that people can put their hands up and sponsor migrants, receive some kind of compensation for doing that, not the kind of compensation that would indenture people, however, there has to be a bright line. And then also they have to have responsibilities to provide voice in the political sphere on behalf of those whom they sponsor. That coupled with a sort of pathway to full political membership, or supports for preserving and maintaining actual voice and access to voice in the country of origin, gives you a sort of array of options for thinking about how people would have access to political empowerment as a part of the structure of migration. So that's roughly the idea. And I'm actually pleased to say it is in operation in bits and pieces. There's that specific example in France. There's the fact that New York passed voting rights for immigrants, right, for non-citizens at the level of the city. That's under consideration in other cities in the US. The H-1B visa program is a model. It could be expanded to other sectors and contexts beyond those who currently have access to it. And here in Massachusetts, we too have the challenge with migration that New York is currently facing and other parts of the country. The political strains have not been so severe in Massachusetts. And that's not simply because we are a democratic state or a blue state that, we have lots of cosmopolitan souls, sprinkled around the Commonwealth. It's actually also because the governor went out of her way at the very beginning of this to try to find a network of civil society organizations all over the Commonwealth who would start working with that kind of sponsorship model. And so it's straining. I don't want to pretend it's not straining, because to the point that's been made, the numbers are really so extraordinary. But it has given this Commonwealth a little more elasticity than we have seen in some other places. So the question is, if that kind of elasticity can then also be developed in other states in this country and in other countries, building from that small seed of the Canadian model, perhaps we start to have the beginnings of that dynamic, flexible system that I think, Charles, you indicated there was a need for. So that is my suggestion, polypolitanism. Let us all be neither nationalists nor cosmopolitans, but polypolitans.
So first, thanks so much to Jonathan, to Nicholas for all of your work organizing today's conversations. It's wonderful to be included, and thank you, Danielle, for those really rich reflections. I suppose I have two kinds of questions. I should say that I'm very taken with the idea of polypolitanism and the thought of moving beyond the politics of nationalism that so shapes how we think of membership and borders, and also the focus on thinking about democracy as historically really bound to various practices of exclusion. And the project for today, not unlike the project for earlier historical periods, is the extent to which we can genuinely have a universal framework for conceiving of democracy as something that's available to all, that produces something like equal and effective freedom, regardless of one's location within the terms of the political community. So two things. The first, in a way, is asking you to reflect on an element of your own work that sometimes your scholarship is associated with. And here I'm thinking especially of our declaration, which is this idea that one of the ways that we deal with the divisiveness that can really compromise rights is through developing rich civic narratives of belonging. So in the context of our declaration, it's the idea that we can infuse founding documents with a kind of egalitarian spirit that's always in motion, and so developing something like a national ethic. Now, versions of that argument can cut in some ways against the focus on attachment to places, the idea of having plural identities. Versions of that argument, here you can think of like Habermas with constitutional patriotism, but other variants say that really the way to ensure that we don't have divided, broken societies that are organized through various kinds of exclusionary cleavages is to have single driving narratives of national belonging. And to have driving narratives of national belonging that are built on redemptive stories about the country as not organized through blood and land, but instead organized through ideas. I'll just note that that's a kind of claim about the centrality of a singular type of political attachment, and that the need to actually have a hierarchy of attachments. Now, I'll say, just as my own personal suspicion, I tend to be uncertain that those kinds of hierarchies, or that the project of constitutional patriotism is actually cashed out in ways that many of the defenders have wanted. But I will note that even just in American politics, when you're thinking about the speeches that somebody like Obama gives, or that Biden gives, that there's a real focus on the idea that the thing that can keep us from the nightmare of white nationalism or the breakdown of American society is to just reinvest in singular stories. And so I'm curious what you see as the relationship between the idea of having plural attachments to place, so to have multiple identities that actually diffuse the centrality of any single identity, and the overarching logic, really, of contemporary American, and in a sense global liberal nationalism, which is, well, we actually have to have a single identity. I'm willing to kind of jettison that focus on the single and really invest in plurality, and at the same time also maybe suggest that if we care as much about social cohesion as we claim to, then in some ways not compelling people to have to believe the same thing or be attached to the same thing might be the best way to get social cohesion. But as somebody that has worked in both of these frames, in a defense of pluralism, but also in a defense of a single national narrative. I'm curious how you navigate that. The second is, I'm also curious about the relationship between your invocation of plural attachments to place and the kind of argument you're making about migration. So a counter-narrative to the story that we heard about mass migration is the argument that a number of really wonderful scholars in international migration law have been developing. So Dan Canstrom, chief among them. I'll invoke Dan, you can disagree, but also I'm thinking of Tendai Achiume's work on migration as decolonization. Chantal Thomas, her work as well on thinking of migration, colonialism, and international law. And the argument goes something like this, that if we just look at the places where people are coming from and the places where people are trying to get to, it maps almost exactly onto the history of colonialism. So it's imperial metropoles that are trying to keep out folks from previously colonized communities. And this is really not a story about the rule of law or culture or norms. This is a story about the long-standing effects of how empires extracted economic benefits from specific parts of the world and then shut out those communities. It was their capital that continues to be in movement, while the actual physical bodies that engage in the hard productive labor are denied access to the benefits. And that's a history of ongoing colonization, and you can see that explicitly right now at the US-Mexican border, where it's Mexican labor that provides the essential foundations for the material reproduction of our own economy, but continue to engage in that work under conditions in which they're denied any meaningful legal labor rights or political rights, including the vote, in ways that reproduce, I should also add, oftentimes detained, and Dan can talk about this, in non-citizen only prison conditions that are segregated and largely Hispanic. All of this replicates elements of the old Jim Crow past. It replicates histories of economic expropriation that reproduces forms of colonial control. That would suggest a fairly radical project of thinking of migration as tied to decolonization. So in the 1930s and 40s, folks that pressed for the independence efforts in places like Puerto Rico or the Philippines, what they wanted as conditions of independence in Puerto Rico was extensive economic provision of resources to Puerto Rico because of the history of extraction and access to easy movement after independence. So Puerto Rico gets independence, it gets extensive financial support from the US as a form of reparations, and people in Puerto Rico have the opportunity to move freely to the US precisely because of the history of colonialism. Now that's something that presses beyond, potentially, the polypolitanism that you're describing. It has lots of key elements in common: extensive legal rights, political rights, an idea of plural identities, so that you can actually, in a deep sense, be a member of a community, let's say in Mexico, and also in the US on both sides of a border that was constructed and imposed on a community that's actually consistent and singular. But at the same time, it might also suggest really extensive reparative obligations to countries that and populations that find themselves in movement. And so that the question then is not really a question about the imperial north, effectively, and how to house populations in movement. It's about the obligations we owe to those communities, both once they're in our border, but also, effectively, in the countries from which they come. So I'm curious about, to what extent is your argument consistent with the migration as decolonization, to use Tendai's language? Does it push back against it? Is it a feasible, let's say, pragmatic organization of it? Or is it something that's fundamentally different? Those are the two questions. Thanks so much.
I might just stand so I can see everybody a little bit better. Shall I, in fact, answer this question? So thank you. Those were really wonderful comments. Very rich and provocative. I don't know Tendaya's argument, so I can't speak directly to the framework that she is.
There's in fact a number of scholars that are developing these types of positions, including Dan here.
But I mean, you'll have to tell me, in other words, what sort of points of connection or disconnection are. But I think yes is the answer. My argument aligns in that I think, in the US, for example, right now, we just sort of live in a mythical state when it comes to how we think about migration. The first sort of most important element of that mythical state is the fact that we have whatever the number is now, 11 million undocumented workers, which supports the sort of proliferation of wage theft in the country, which means that the sort of 19th century bright line commitment to building an economy based on free labor has been eroded. And we just sort of walk around every day kind of completely complicit and complacent about that and not really attending to it. And that is something that I criticize. So in that regard, that is sort of a first piece of that question of how people who are being exploited by the economy that is sort of functioning to support democracy, exit that state of exploitation. So in that regard, I think yes, that's probably consistent. And in general, I do think that there is also work to do sort of supporting the rule of law and its the ability to come into existence elsewhere. I take the Marshall Plan post-World War II in Europe as a kind of core model for how US foreign policy should be structured, and that does also relate to the question of what is owed to Mexico and Central America and so on. So I think there probably are a lot of affinities there actually, but I need to learn more. On the first question, I make an argument about the need to cultivate civic identity, drawing on the sort of work of, old work, this point, anthropologists like Clifford Geertz on, sort of thick and thin interpretation of culture, right? The notion that you can have a kind of thick concept of culture and a thin concept. And the basic idea of civic identity is that that's a sort of thin concept of identity that needs to be connected to whatever thick concept of identity all of us bring to the table. And so it produces a kind of picture of identity where to participate in a democracy means everybody kind of connects their island via a bridge to some sort of shared island, which is that sort of basic set of norms that sustain democracy and the rule of law. And those are actually kind of minimalist, in fact, and they don't actually define for everybody what their conception of the good is. You can, on your own island, define a lot of your conception of the good as long as it's consistent with universal inclusion, rule of law, nonviolence, and for dispute resolution, a few other basic norms. So, and it's that sort of mental image that I sort of am naming it, the notion that we're all trying to cross a bridge from our own islands to sort of be in some shared spaces together. We can also go back to our own islands now and then, like enjoy our attachment to that specific place. And then there's kind of free movement back and forth, psychologically speaking. That's the kind of conception of identity that I think is necessary to sustain this sort of idea of polypolitanism that they're talking about. And I honestly think it's consistent with the work I did earlier in our declaration. I've always been interested in how this country could have plural yet shared narrative, and it's that sort of conjunction that matters for describing even where the sort of civic pieces of the narrative come in.
This is a wonderful exchange, which I want us all to continue informally over drinks and reception. I see a quick two-finger from Paul here.
If I could just draw one point of contact, I think the direction that you're going, Danielle, is interesting and worth exploring. The way I conceptualized this was that there were some choices one had to make. One was give up local democracy, which is like a huge concession, but the other one is give up on equal treatment under the law. And my reading was that, places where there are like two-class kinds of citizenships often go badly. And so what I went for is just give up on local democracy, but try and protect equal treatment under the law. But there's a whole spectrum there, and I think it's good to explore all of these. But I think it is good for us all to just recognize that we're going to have to give up somewhere if we're going to come up with a compromise solution.
Although I guess I would just briefly say that I think to your point, that may not be giving up, right? It may be getting us to a better place that's not exploitative, right? And so in that regard, holistically, for the whole of humanity, perhaps a gain.
Okay. Well, I love how this has gone from the abstract and theoretical to the increasingly concrete. I don't know if we're there yet, but we're underway, and I'm really, really grateful. Just give me 30 seconds to thank folks. Nicholas, hey, Smota, thank you for all of your assistance putting everything together. Center for Centers at Boston College was extremely helpful. Our faculty affiliates, Chandra Malapali, Natala Dulambas, Paula Barroso, and Aziz Rana. And let me single out our benefactor, Chuck Plow, who is here with us tonight, to thank you for your vision and leadership in helping create this center. And finally, I would like to welcome you to please come next week to hear journalist Vincent Bevins on the missing protest decade on October 12th, and there are a couple of more distinguished lectures this fall. And please join us in the other room for reception. Thank you again.